Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 8 of season 2 of Lower Decks, called I, Excretus. And I enjoyed this episode, it had a lot of funny moments. However, my small criticism of the show is that it spends so much time with all these references that they don't really do anything new. And so I think sometimes that it would have been more interesting if the show simply did a straight up Star Trek story with some real stakes, some real consequences, some universe building, even some sequels to old ideas continuing the story, but instead they're simply kind of rehashing everything and just making a parody of it. So even though the show is very entertaining, it's always a little bit disappointing because I always feel like it could have done more, it could have been more interesting. And just for a quick example, I knew the Borg Queen is going to show up in the episode because I actually looked up the actress Alice Krige on IMDb and I saw that she's going to be in this episode, and so I thought to myself, oh cool, so finally the Borg are back as villains. Maybe they'll explain that credit sequence when everyone are fighting the Borg. Even if it's inside the cartoon, it can be so interesting and they can progress that storyline, they can explain what happened to the Borg and so on. And yet in the end it was all just a holodeck simulation, so none of that really mattered, and it was just a self-parody of previous shows and movies, and so part of me is kind of disappointed. On the other hand, if they did as I suggest, then they wouldn't be able to do as much comedy and parodies. So I'm kind of torn between these two extremes basically. I think they could have found some kind of middle ground and do both at the same time. So part of me feels a little bit disappointed. On the other hand, I am very entertained by a lot of the jokes and a lot of the references. And it's obvious that this show is made by real fans who get what was so fun about the old Star Trek shows, because they kind of pay respect to it and poke fun at it in a loving way, so it's like a love letter to all the previous Star Trek stuff. And there is so much correct attention to detail that I really enjoy it. As a nitpicking nerd, I recognize so many little things, and it's so satisfying to me to see it done so correctly with all the little details right. And you know, all the old Star Trek shows always had a lot of silly stuff in them, and all that silliness was part of what made it entertaining. A lot of the craziest ideas were often the most fun as well. Even though sometimes maybe it's a little bit silly when it completely breaks any suspension of disbelief, and that was also one of my complaints in a previous episode, when sometimes they show aliens which are too bizarre to be even remotely believable. So like that replicating guy, even though it's kind of similar to the Tribbles, but the Tribbles, for example, were grounded in reality because they said in their episode that they are eating stuff to replicate. They're not just creating endless copies out of nowhere. So it was a little bit more grounded and more realistic and more believable compared to this alien who can just self-replicate endlessly. And in this new episode, they have this alien woman who can split herself into 3 parts, and I know it's an alien from the old animated Star Trek show, and that show also had a lot of silly stuff. And what's funny about that show is that most of the time it did it seriously. It wasn't trying to be a comedy, it was just trying to be a science fiction show, but it was kind of too silly a lot of the times. And it's something I didn't really like about that show, because it just did a lot of silly ideas and tried to do it in a serious way. It wasn't done for comedy, it was just done as a serious science fiction idea, but it was kind of stupid, so I didn't really like all that kind of stuff in that old show. And in this show they often have references to that animated show, and part of me enjoys that, again, for the sake of just a correct reference. And what better opportunity is to do some kind of sequel with all those silliest ideas from TAS, if not in another animated show, especially since this one is a comedy, so they can get away with a lot of silly stuff. So this alien that can split into 3 parts was actually from that old Star Trek cartoon, but they're not really doing anything that funny with it. It was just kind of distracting for no reason. If they actually used it somehow for the sake of the story or the character, and they did something interesting with it or something really funny with it, then maybe it would have been worth it, but they didn't really do that. They did have some wordplay, they did do some comedy with the language, you know, getting ahead of yourself and stuff like that, but it wasn't really that funny, so I'm not sure if it was worth it to show that silly alien just for the sake of a silly joke like that. And sometimes it feels like this show is trying too hard, because they're trying to cram in as many references as possible, as quickly as possible, instead of taking the time to actually enjoy some of these scenarios and some of these setups, which have more potential to play with, and yet they just cram in so many of them, and by doing that they miss some of that potential. So for example, they all go into these individual holodeck programs, and so in one of them there's a hologram simulation of the mirror universe, and it's a lot of fun. but it's just 1 minute and it's over. And I think it had the potential to do a lot more funny stuff in that setup. And they even managed to cram in a reference to another science fiction movie, which is not even related to Star Trek, but they also crammed it in. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, when Boimler from the Mirror Universe recognized that Mariner is not one of them, and then he pointed at her and kind of screamed. So that was a funny reference to a completely different science fiction movie, so I did enjoy that. And it was funny seeing the evil mirror versions of all the characters, and again, I think they could have done so much more with that. And Tandy is inside a simulation, which is basically a parody of that TNG episode Ethics, when Worf broke his back and wanted to commit suicide because of that. And they kind of poked fun at that directly, especially when that Klingon said that he broke his back by picking a peanut from the floor. I thought that was hilarious because of how easily Worf broke his back in TNG, and I think it happened more than once. And those silly medical uniforms from early TNG. And I love how they even paid attention to the Klingon feet, which are supposed to have those little horns. We saw that in TNG. And we also have this reference to a TOS episode with this very cheap looking set of the Wild West, which is exactly how it looked like in that episode. But again, they didn't really do much with it. They just showed it and moved on. So why not play with that a little bit more? Why not actually do something with it? And not just, oh look, remember this from that episode, and then they move on to something else. Like this scene from the old movies when someone has to go into the reactor to save the ship and to sacrifice himself. And so everything looks very correctly, exactly as it looked like in that movie. So I really praise the show for the attention to detail. But they didn't really do that much with it. So it's nice to see it. It looks great. But they didn't really do anything with it. And maybe the most interesting part was Boymers Adventure, in which he's inside the simulation of a Borg cube and he's supposed to escape. And we see the cute Borg babies, which we never saw since their first appearance in the first episode about the Borg called Q-Who back in TNG. So the part when Boimler tries to save the Borg babies actually reminds me of some of my own thoughts about that old TNG episode, which I always thought could have been better if they actually did try to save the Borg babies. If they did such a scene back then, that would have elevated that episode a lot. And so seeing that here is maybe my favorite part of the episode. And this is the kind of stuff I wish they would have done a serious episode about. Can you imagine if they actually did a full episode about them encountering the Borg and actually making it part of the plot, in which they actually do try to save some innocent Borg babies and to rescue them and not just kill everyone, just blow up the entire cube as they did back in TNG all the time? Why not do a more ethical kind of story in which they actually try to save some of them? So seeing that part was really fun to me, but again it was all done just for jokes and just for comedy, and it could have been so much more interesting and inspiring if they had a slightly more serious episode with a new story. Why not bring back the Borg as actual villains and have a whole episode about that, and have this little subplot of actually saving some Borg babies? That could have been so great. And it was still great. It was a lot of fun to see this. And it was really funny how he kept resetting the simulation because he wanted to get a higher score, and so he kept saving more and more babies each time until he's literally covered with babies and even adult Borg drones because he tries to save all of them. And then in the end he even meets the Borg Queen and all of that. And that was actually Alice Cridge doing the voice of the Borg Queen, even though she sounded kind of slightly, maybe it's because she's older, she didn't really sound exactly the same, so that was a little bit disappointing. And it sounded like she's kind of phoning it in a little bit, so I wish they would have done kind of more creepy lines, maybe do some more sensual stuff. And speaking of sensual, they also did a parody of the TNG episode The Naked Now, which was the episode in which everyone became drunk and a lot of the crew started sleeping with each other and all of that. So they did the same kind of thing here, and they took it to extremes, which I do find funny. I personally enjoy crude jokes and adult humor and all of that kind of stuff, so whenever they do it, and the more outrageous it is, the funnier it is. And in some ways, I guess it's also progressive and all of that. And even Gene Roddenberry himself wanted to do stuff like that. When they made the episode Captain's Holiday on TNG, Gene Roddenberry actually wanted to show men kissing men and women kissing women in the background and implying they're having sex and all of that kind of stuff, which they couldn't really do back in the 90s. But Gene Roddenberry wanted that, so maybe he would have enjoyed seeing his fantasy come true in this show. So I actually think he wouldn't have minded seeing all that kind of stuff. So I don't really mind that, even though they kind of take it to extremes in some places. But in many ways that is the funniest part. And especially that guy riding the first officer and he has a horror gun in his hand and he's beating him with it and all of that. It really reminds me of some of my own parodies that I did of TNG on my other channels. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just type in parody TNG edit and you'll see a lot of stuff like that with the TNG crew. And meanwhile, the senior crew are inside simulations in which they have to do the job of the lower decks, mainly stacking crates in cargo bays, which I talked about in a previous review, about how silly it is that they have to do manual jobs like that, even though they're supposed to have tractor beams and transporters and robots, and then they have to manually carry stuff around and stack crates and all of that. But thinking back on TNG, we actually did see crew members doing that in the background, which I kind of find funny now, because we did get to see people manually carrying stuff around, and also it was very silly how poorly secured all of that stuff always was in the cargo bays, especially those barrels, you know, the ones who fell on Worf and broke his back. All those barrels standing on top of each other without any kind of security measure to keep them in place, even though the ship constantly shakes. You know how many times something happens and the entire ship shakes and then all those barrels fall down. So they kind of poke fun at that in this scene when they have to keep stacking them even when the ship is under attack and it keeps shaking and everything falls down again. So I found that funny as well. That's a clever poke at something that was always inherently silly in TNG and kind of became unintentional comedy. And I personally made a lot of compilations of stuff like that, you know, the amount of time Worf gets injured, how easily he breaks his back and all of that. So they poked fun at a lot of those silly stuff from the old shows, which I myself always poked fun at, so I found all of that really funny. They also did a parody of that wormhole scene from Star Trek The Motion Picture when everything became really blurry and all of that, so they did the exact same special effect when they were close to a black hole. And the only missed opportunity in this scene is that someone should have slowly said that they have to fire photon torpedoes. If they did that, that would have been extremely funny, so I think that was a missed opportunity that no one on the bridge said that they have to use photon torpedoes. So I really wish they would have done that. That would have made that scene much funnier and more worthwhile. And they even met the Crystalline Entity again, which I thought was destroyed back in TNG. Didn't they say it was the only one of its kind? I guess I don't mind the idea that there are more of them. That would actually make sense and would be more interesting. And this is another example of something that has a very interesting potential of something to play with. And they kind of wasted it here because they showed the Crystalline Entity, oh look, it's another of those entities, and then they kind of easily escaped it and they basically turned it into a joke. So it's not really threatening, it's not really scary. They didn't really do anything with it, they just showed it and moved on. So this is another example of a missed opportunity of something they could have done a lot more with and didn't. So it's fun to see it, it's great to see it in fact, but it's also a bit disappointing because they just showed it and moved on. And the same as the Borg Queen, which I thought they could do a lot more with, but they just kind of made a quick parody of a few scenes from First Contact and that's it. And the same with Boimler getting assimilated. It was a nice callback back to Locutus, and that also is what gave the episode its name, because he called himself Excretus of Borg, which is kind of funny, but again it was a quick scene, a quick reference, and then it's the end of the holodeck simulation and everything is back to normal. And I just think it could have been so much cooler and more interesting if they actually did it in a more serious way and not just have it all inside holodeck simulations. And he even repeated some of Picard's lines from the episode Family when he was recovering from his assimilation. And this felt a little bit disrespectful and not really funny. They're basically poking fun at a serious, dramatic scene from TNG and just turning it into a joke. So this one feels a little bit in bad taste and not really funny. And I guess it's nice that it's a correct reference, but it's not really funny. So I think if something is not funny or interesting or entertaining, then they shouldn't just do it just for the sake of a reference. They should only do it if it's either important for the story, if the episode has its own story. If it's important for that, then that's good. If it's really funny that it's worth it, it's also fine. Or if it's very interesting, if it has some kind of use to it. If it's just there just to be there, just to say, oh look at us, how much we know all the trivia from the old shows, then it's not really worth it, and in some cases it even ruins it. So that final line was a little bit disrespectful because it's not really funny, so what's the point of doing that? What's the point of making fun of a serious, dramatic, emotional scene from TNG if it's not even that funny, so it's not worth it. So this one was a little bit annoying in my opinion. So overall, I enjoyed the episode. Most of it I found funny and entertaining. I enjoyed most of the references, but I still think the show could have been so much better if they did actual stories and some consequences and not just holodeck simulations all the time, just for the sake of quick parodies and references, which are a lot of fun, but it's not enough. It's basically just riding on the back on all the previous shows, which were much better because, you know, all those shows always had a lot of comedy. They were always funny as well, but they were also interesting because they had stories and they had originality and they had imagination, and that's what made them great even till this day. And this show is basically doing imitations of that and parodies of that, but it's not really adding a lot of new things in most episodes. And so I do enjoy the show, I do like it, but I think it could have been more. I think it could have been better. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.